Live. Good. I think we are
Excellent.
officially
Smooth
connected.
intro, Jim.
Yeah, we land on this airplane already. Well, hi, Karen.
Hey, Jim. How you doing?
I'm doing well. I feel like I just saw you because I did in New
Yep,
York,
indeed.
in part because we were there to celebrate the launch of In Pursuit, which is the Substack webpage where everyone is watching what will be a fabulous conversation between the two of us over the next 30 minutes. Um, I guess I should introduce myself. I'm Jim Ambuske. I'm Director of Digital History for In Pursuit. And very briefly, In Pursuit is an initiative of More Perfect. And over the course of the year, we are releasing exciting and wonderful essays by people like today's guest, Karin Wulf, who I'll introduce in just a moment, exploring the lives and legacies, but more importantly, the lessons of presidents and first ladies as we approach the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, and the ways in which we can take those lessons from America's past to write the history of America's future, because we've got a lot of work to do. But to get that process started, we kicked off this week with essays by President George W. Bush on President George Washington, and an essay by Karin Wulf on Martha Washington. And Karin, I'm very excited to talk to you for In Pursuit. We've known each other for a long time, so we've got a lot of stories to tell about various shenanigans and various archives and things like that on both sides of the Atlantic. But
True
more
story.
importantly, yeah, true story, including Windsor Castle, well, right in the lion's den uh, of George III. But you are presently the director and librarian of the John Carter Brown Library, which is an independent research library on the campus of Brown University. And Karin, thank you very much for joining us today.
I'm so glad to be here. I'm delighted to be talking with you about this great project and about Martha Washington.
Well, let's talk about Martha in just a second, but clearly you're in your library. For those folks who don't know anything about the John Carter Brown Library, what should we know? And can I have a fellowship to come research there?
Absolutely. Everybody gets one. It's like Oprah, you get one and you get one and you get one. So the John Carter Brown Library is a marvelous library. It is a leading research library around the world, really, for the study of the early Americas. It is an extraordinarily rich collection that looks at the full hemisphere from the late 1400s to the early 1800s. And so we have all the greatest hits of British North America and the American Revolution, but also the full Caribbean and South American context. And we've just opened an exhibit called 1776 Across the Americas, which features, for example, in its central case, one of our copies of the Declaration of Independence, and also the first map of San Francisco, the Pedro Font map of 1776, which is just a kind of taster of our approach to this very important 250th year.
Well, I've not seen that map, so now I'm going to come see that map. That sounds really cool. Oh, well, Karin, you wrote about Martha Washington, and I think that one of the important points we wanted to make about the project is it's not just the presidents, it's also the first ladies who are central to the story that we're telling in this phase of the project. We're only in phase one. We'll get to phase two next year. But if I could paraphrase from one of Martha Washington's successors, why is it important to remember the first ladies?
Right, exactly. Well, there's so much to say about why first ladies matter. And I mean, one thing is to note, as we talked about in an event that we did in New York on Monday night on President's Day to kind of kick off the project in another dimension, you know, first ladies help us understand the changing role of women and the changing ideas about gender across the 250 years of the United States. And to say that there's a difference between Martha Washington and Abigail Adams, and then first ladies of the 21st century is to state the completely obvious, but they help us to see distinctions and changes that are really, really remarkable in across American history. That's one. The second is that I think that the first ladies help us move away from some of the things that all right, maybe I'm going to be a little spicy here, but sometimes I feel like kind of the presidents kind of trap us in kind of capital H history, like politics, wars, economics, the kind of all of those things that make capital H history, but take us away from the things that most influence and impact people day to day, which is families and domestic economies and communities. And there are many ways in which the first ladies help us see that a bit more clearly.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And I love what you said about there being a gulf in time and change over time between Martha Washington and, say, Laura Bush or
Mm,
Michelle Obama. But
hmm
even within Martha's life, right, there's a huge, you might say, revolutionary change. So can you help us a little bit about think through Martha's life and the kind of person that she was and the kinds of changes that she experienced in her own life before we even get to the presidency in the tail end of the 18th century?
Yeah, well, so she's born in 1731. She's actually a little older than George Washington. Was born in 1732. She's born in 1731. She's married for the first, and she's a Virginian. As I say in the essay, she and George Washington are both elite privileged Virginians through and through. So she's a Virginia lady. She's born to a family that's not quite as wealthy as the Washingtons would be, but a very comfortable family. They are enslaving people on their plantation. And she's married before she's 20 years old to a much older guy. She has a couple of kids with him. He dies. She remarries this other guy that we end up learning a whole lot about, George Washington. They don't have children together, but they do raise her two children, and they end up taking in other relatives, other young relatives, to take care of over the course of their time together. And she essentially is the mistress of what becomes an enormous concern, like five different plantations beyond Mount Vernon, as well as many hundreds of enslaved people. So her life goes from being a quite privileged but relatively ordinary young, free, elite Virginia woman to being arguably the most famous woman and consequential woman in the early United States. So that's quite a trajectory.
Can you help us think about those intervening years, the interregnum between the death of Daniel Parke Custis and the marriage of George Washington, when Martha is once again a single woman, but she has very particular property rights in both land and enslaved people, very particular legal rights as a widowed woman. Can you help us
Mm-hmm.
understand what she's doing in those years and the ways in which she, in a very real sense, I think, or at least I would argue, becomes a plantation master in her own right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting because she's a widow for a brief period of time at two key moments in her life when her
Mhm.
first husband, Daniel Parke Custis, dies, 1757. And then, of course, when George Washington dies at the very end of 1799. And she's a widow the first time for just about 18 months, maybe. She's got two young children. She had four children, two of them died quite young. She's got two young children. And she has to essentially manage all of the family's estate interests. Now, it's important to note that the law really confines what even elite, privileged women like Martha Washington can do in terms of property. Once they're married, women's property essentially, and their public persona really becomes kind of covered by their husband. It becomes enveloped in the marriage under the principle of coverture. And there's strict laws that govern what kind of property married women can have. Their husbands, even if married women have their own property, even if they inherit property from their parents, for example, certain of that property is immediately under the control of their husbands. Only if your parents are really super careful and strategize and keep your property away from a husband. I've seen that happen. It did not happen with her. Um, but so, two times in her life, when her first husband and then when George Washington died, she's the person who really has to manage the property. But she would have expected that that would have been the case. Like, she wasn't completely blown away by this because she would have seen this experience with other women in her circle. And she had to kind of make some choices. She makes some strategic choices, both in that first period of widowhood and also in the second period of widowhood. And it's an interesting thing. You can stop me and ask me to talk about something else, but I'm going to run on about this for
No,
a
keep going.
minute. But it's an interesting thing that, there are so few kind of transhistorical phenomena where we say, like, this is a thing
Mhm.
that's true across time and space. But one of them is that women, when they're widowed, remarry much less frequently and much less quickly than men do. Men,
Mhm.
when they lose their wives And especially in early America, we have really good evidence for this. They marry fast. Again, women tend to take longer. She's actually pretty quick among that group because, and one speculation is that, women, when they have some control over property, maybe that feels comfortable to them. Maybe that's, they feel like they've kind of moved into that situation and seems okay. She's, in her late 20s. Certainly she would have been a super desirable match for someone like George Washington, who's kind of on his way up because her first husband had been very wealthy. He was much wealthier than the family that she was born into. And so she would have brought with her, um, under coverture, what happens is women get this kind of carve out ability to manage property when they're widows, and she would have been able to manage the property for her children. All of that management capacity would have transferred to her new husband when she remarries. So George Washington, when he marries her, comes into quite a lot of property to manage. And by manage, we mean it's not just a responsibility, it is that too, but it's also the opportunity to make money from that
Right.
stuff and those people. Um, so anyway, her strategy, and there's no doubt that she certainly had a great deal of affection for George Washington. Their letters and the accounts of everyone who knew them suggest that this was a kind of a warm relationship. Um, but she decides that she's going to marry, and she probably had a number of opportunities, but he seemed to be smart, nice, and pretty good looking, and you know he was a good match. So the strategy is marry again for her, not for it wasn't for everyone.
For sure, sure. And I just noticed that we have a chat feature, so if folks in the audience want to ask some
Oh
questions,
wow.
please do let us know so we can ask some questions here of the audience here in a few minutes if folks are so inclined to pose one. What was interesting is you were talking about the legal strategies to get around coverture. In some of my own work, I have seen, that very case where fathers and husbands or fathers and brothers on behalf of their sisters or daughters have been very clever in the ways in which they have maneuvered around common law
Yes.
so that they can protect property from
Hmm.
husbands or potential
Hmm.
fiancés they don't trust necessarily. So that's one kind of source that we can use to help reconstruct these lives. Martha is really interesting in that there's not a whole lot of textual evidence that survives from her.
No.
And on Monday night in at the New York Historical for the launch of In Pursuit, the panel of which you were a part, which included Secretary Lonnie Bunch and Professor David Blight and Professor and former Harvard President Drew Faust, and Colleen Shogan, moderated by Colleen Shogan, we're talking about the process of history and the ways in which historians go about doing their work. So,
Mhm.
how did you go about working on this essay for Martha Washington? Where did you find the sources to rebuild this life?
Well, first of all, I have to say that any responsible historian would say, that there are people who have written about Martha Washington. And of course, I have learned a great deal from those folks. I think about Cassandra Good's recent book, First Family, on the Washington descendants. Of course, they're not George Washington's descendants, but they're the descendants of Martha's children that he helped raise. I think about Mary Thompson's wonderful work, long time researcher at Mount Vernon. I think about Marie Jenkins Schwartz from right here in Rhode Island, who wrote a wonderful book on founding first ladies and slavery that was quite helpful to me in kind of pulling out some of the details of enslaved people at Mount Vernon. But also there, and I have to say too, the incredible research that the folks at Mount Vernon do in general. Like, you can visit mountvernon.org and you can learn a lot about George, Martha, their family, enslaved people who lived there. But I was very beholden to the papers of Martha Washington, this wonderful volume. You can see all the tabs here. These are the ones that I just haven't pulled out. But this volume is fantastic. It's from the George Washington papers at the University of Virginia, which has been going for 56 years now, I think, and is just about almost ready to wrap up their final volume of the papers of George Washington. All the papers of Martha Washington, meaning everything they survives that we know of that she wrote to anyone or that was written to her, fits in this one volume. And if you saw how many rows of volumes of the papers of George
Right.
Washington, you would understand that when we're working with even a very elite woman like Martha Washington were often working with fragmentary evidence. They just don't leave as much.
Yeah.
And Martha also is a little particular in that regard because she did burn all of her
Mhm.
correspondence with George Washington. So there are only 4 letters that survive between the two of them. So you're working in kind of what survives, which is often super partial. Lots of her letters with a niece, for example, that survive,
Mhm.
but not so much between Martha and her children. So that's just an example of how you're sort of thinking about what have other scholars done? How can we think about the material evidence, like what survives of her dresses? There are 3 dresses that we know were
Mhm.
worn by Martha Washington that survive. Fabulous pair of her purple silk shoes that she wore to her wedding with George Washington, which are quite a thing, um, and and obviously the places that she lived. But then these like fragments of textual evidence that are everything from like receipts to her letters to this niece that are really warm and musing, to sometimes her super harsh kind of treatment of people that come across
Mhm.
in letters to people who are managing Mount Vernon when she's not there.
Well, and I love the juxtaposition between what survives of George's and what survives of hers. I
Yeah,
mean, I think if I remember rightly, the George Papers of George Washington project started in like what
in the
1968,
60s.
something
Yeah,
like that.
yeah,
Yeah, and
yeah.
years ago,
2018 was the 50th. Yeah, uh-huh.
yeah,
Yeah,
exactly, and still not done. But it's
yeah.
it's hard work, right? But I remember years ago when I was a graduate student, I was a research assistant at the University of Virginia for the Papers of George Washington, and I was helping with, I think it was the volume, it was for June and July of 1779, just those 2 months, right?
Right.
That constituted an entire volume. And Martha,
Yeah.
who just got the
Yep.
one,
Just this
you
one.
know,
Highly recommended, though. And the editorial apparatus, if you're not familiar with reading these kinds of documentary editions, they're so fantastic
mhm,
because not only do they have the transcription of a particular item, but it's got careful notes about who the person
right.
was. I just happened to open one that is from a letter from Elizabeth Schuyler Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton's wife, to Martha in
You just
July
happened
of
to do
seven.
it.
I did. I really did. I just like I could do this for here's another. I mean, Elizabeth Willing Powell. There you go, Sam. If you're on
There you
here,
go. Yeah.
actually just open to another two Elizabeth Willing Powell. So, but there are letters here, but they're also just like receipts. But it gives you this fantastic long. This is one footnote to this one document, for example. So it's transcriptions and it's materials kept from. These are drawn from over 60 libraries and archives around the world, like every known thing, textual piece of evidence that to or from Martha Washington. So it's an incredible work of scholarship, but it's also a darn good read.
Right.
Highly recommend.
Well, and I think it's a great, it's a great example of why you should fund the humanities because that takes a hell of a lot of work. That's not something you
Yes.
just do in a couple of weeks.
Takes a team, takes
Takes a
expertise.
team.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
Exactly. We do actually have Karen, a question from the audience,
Yeah.
wondering about Martha Washington accompanying George Washington to Valley Forge and various encampments. Was this typical of other
Mhm.
spouses of officers during the Revolution, or was it unique to her case?
I think what's distinctive about her is that he's so prominent, and
Mhm.
she makes an effort to be there every time, every winter encampment, and that's, I think, distinctive. Other women absolutely went to, because they're trying not to fight in the winter, right? It's like you don't
Right.
you try to make camp and you stay put, right? And you don't move around too much. I'm not a military expert, but I'm just saying, even I have observed this fact. Um, but the thing that's interesting is that of course, a lot of women do, and also sometimes their spouses really expect it.
Mhm.
My phone happens to be resting right now. I'm not going to pick it up because my phone will flip over if I do, but it happens to be resting on a volume of letters from Nathaniel Greene,
Oh, yeah.
who people argue is like, George Washington's greatest general from Rhode Island, obviously. He's got these letters to his wife, Catherine Greene, where he, this is, I can't believe I'm actually remembering this particular piece. But he's got this letter to her where he's like, I'm really missing you. And these young ladies in Philadelphia seem really great. And I think you should like hurry up and hustle back because I'm missing our domestic felicities. Yeah, a little bit pressure. And she writes back and she's like, I just had a baby. And in fact, the baby that she just had was Martha Washington Greene. So, 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 so yes, I think women did, and I think their husbands really wanted to be with their wives. Sometimes we can say that's lovely. I think in the case of Nathaniel Green, it's a little bit of pressure on a young mother who's just given birth, and not so. Yeah. Anyway, little
Well,
shady.
it's just it goes to show too that the fun material isn't just confined to Bridgerton; it's also in Revolutionary America,
Mhm. Mhm, mhm. I've been trying
especially
to
with the
write something
Greens.
up on this little green, exchange because it's quite something. In fact, another friend of theirs writes to him and says, "No, really, like, it wasn't so easy, this birth," you know? Anyway, so
Good, good Lord. Uh, way to go, Nathaniel. Although the brewery in North Carolina is pretty good.
there you go.
Shout out to those folks. So one of the things that I think is really interesting about Martha, and particularly the essay you wrote, because each of these essays has like a lesson, right? A stated
Mm,
lesson. In
mhm,
your case, it was, before women could hold office, she created one. She
mhm.
is the first lady. There is no precedent. There are things that she could draw on as is accompanying George as commander in chief, to various encampments. But this thing is new. And what's
Yeah.
also interesting, and I've been thinking about this for a while, but particularly since the other day, after a bunch of meetings, I stole an hour. I went down to the Battery in New York City because I wanted to walk
Mm,
the old colonial city. You can still walk the
mhm.
streets that
Yeah.
that the Dutch settlers did, but I went to Bowling Green to see where George III statue
Where the
was.
statue came down.
Yeah, and
Yes.
where it came down, in
It was
July
only up so briefly,
1776.
right, yeah. Poor brief,
Yeah,
yeah,
and it was a pretty cool one too. But
yeah,
that is a tale for another time for sure.
indeed.
Um, but I was thinking about the transition from monarchical America to Republican America, and
Mm,
it strikes me, and I'd be curious to know your thoughts, that we Americans were more monarchical than I think we give them credit
mm,
for,
mhm.
and that fealty, not fealty to monarchy, but the trappings of monarchy and the accoutrement of monarchy persisted long after the
Yeah.
revolution is over. Probably, I would think, even to the ways in which George and Martha tried to structure the presidency, the first lady.
Mhm.
Do you see sort of the legacies of monarchy and the trappings of monarchy and the accoutrements of monarchy in some of the things that she does as she's trying to essentially create this new thing?
Mm. Well, as you know, Jim, I've written this book about lineage and the way that genealogy is this way of thinking that really structures early America through the law, through politics, through culture, and that lasts through the early United States. And one of the things that always jumps out at me, one of the material pieces at Mount Vernon is this amazing portrait that the French king sent to George Washington early in his presidency. And it's in this extraordinary gold frame with the French monarch's coat of arms carved at the top and the Washington coat of arms carved at the bottom. Just making this kind of symbolic connection between, great families. Um, I think there are many ways in which, so I guess that's just to say that on all sides, like Europeans too, were trying to figure out, like, how are you supposed to deal with these Americans? Like, we know how
Right.
to deal monarchy to monarchy. What's the diplomatic, protocol when you're dealing with this new thing, this democracy? How's that going to work? But for the Washingtons, they too are trying to figure that out. I mean, Martha Washington grew up thinking that she would be a plantation mistress and a hostess, and she understood hostessing. So she understood how to kind of kit out a place so that you could be a generous and, kind of um, welcoming and certainly a kind of gracious. I guess that's the word I'm looking for, a gracious hostess. Um, so, she does things in the presidential mansions, the early presidential mansions in New York and then Philadelphia, where she, sets up the household. That famously, they have this china that has all the states around the rim, and then her initials in the middle of the china. There's a few surviving pieces of that at Mount Vernon. And that very emblematic of a kind of, aristocratic, certainly style. And then when she is welcoming people into these kind of salons type gatherings, she has a set schedule. She welcomes ladies on a specific day of the week. to come to the house. Men go too. And then she stands up on this kind of raised dais. Somebody read this in my piece and then texted me and said, like, I want a raised dais too. But like people wondered, like, why is she like standing up there so she can greet people, almost like the way that the monarch's throne is on
Right.
this raised dais. Like, how is that a kind of democratic thing? But they're trying to find a kind of middle way. They know that they have to have some kind of indication of their status, um, that's elevated, but
Mhm.
they can't go, whole king and queen. So I think they're trying to find a middle path. And I think the other thing that's really important to remember is not only is she raised to be this like Virginia hostess, but and so there's a bit of a parallel there, but also monarchy is the system they know. That's what they
Right.
knew to mean like authority and how you perform authority. So it shouldn't be a surprise to us that they take some of the kind of practices and, as you said, accoutrement of that system.
Well, and as a spoiler for a future essay coming in a few weeks, Catherine Allgore is writing about Dolly Madison, and
Yes.
she has some of the same observations of what Dolly does for her famous Mrs. Madison's Wednesday nights, but
Yes.
folks will have to wait a few weeks to learn more about that. Karen, as we're kind of winding down our conversation here, thinking about the 250th and thinking about the moment that we're in, and we're 50 years past the bicentennial, and some of us the other night were thinking about or talking about what it was like in the bicentennial. Making no assumptions, but I was not there during the bicentennial, so I have no
I
idea.
was, Jim. It's okay. You
Yeah.
can assume. I was there. I was so
But
young.
how so young, yeah. But how are you thinking about what are your observations about how historians have reinterpreted early America, but particularly the
Mm,
revolutionary period since the bicentennial?
mm. Well, I think there's so many things that happened out of the bicentennial, and one of them is that we got, I mean, we were mentioning this the other night, just a profusion of
Mhm.
historical societies and historical organizations, but also fantastic investments in scholarship. Like some of these documentary editions that we were talking about got a kind of jet fuel of funding out of the bicentennial and the commitment to understanding American history, which then also helped fuel a kind of broader understanding of American history to include not just George and Martha, but also all of the people who lived and worked at places
Mhm.
like Mount Vernon or in all kinds of other circumstances. And that kind of more complex rendering of the past, to my mind, is a massively optimistic investment because I think no one can look around and say that we don't live in a very complex, diverse, often contested society. And it can
Right.
feel like this is freshly new that we're so united and divided. And to be fair, there are some things that are distinct and new now. But the thing is, the 18th century, when these people were working out A, the revolution, and B, a kind of new framework of government, it was no less complicated, no
Mhm.
less diverse kind of place. So, understanding that fullest history, I think better equips us for the moment we're in now.
Who are you reading right now who you think to yourself, by golly, this person's doing good history?
Oh my gosh, this is a problem. I'm always reading so many things at once. It's genuinely terrible. I'm going to tell you that right on my desk right now, well, okay, holding up my phone are two books right now.
Yeah.
These volumes of Nathaniel Green, but also I'm rereading Martha Jones's Trouble of Color, which is a
Hmm.
family memoir of her family in the 19 starting in the 19th century and then into the 20th century. I find family histories and a kind of new generation of family histories to be incredibly powerful ways of linking us to some of those key themes in American history, some of that complexity and some of the ways that people grappled with it. So I'm rereading Martha Jones's book for the umpty time, along with about nine other things.
I no, I totally agree. I actually haven't read that yet, so I'm going to put that on
Oh
my
my gosh, it's such
ever
a treat.
expanding pile.
Put
Of
aside time because you won't put it down once you pick it up.
Yeah. Well, and I actually, just speaking of rereading, I just reread Flora Frazier's
Oh,
Pretty,
yes.
Pretty
So
Young
excellent.
Rebel about Flora
Yeah.
MacDonald. Speaking of
Laura
someone who
McDonald.
experienced
Yes.
dramatic change and revolution in two
Yes.
senses, both in the Jacobite
Yes.
Rebellion and then the American Revolution.
I know.
Um,
Incredible
so,
story. You kind of can't, literally incredible story. You can't believe it. Yeah.
well, and it's frustrating in many respects because it's so damn good that I know I'm like, how do I actually finish the book that I'm writing? But we'll we'll actually get there.
Well, this
Well,
is because we draw on one
yeah,
another's work, inspiration and
exactly.
information.
Exactly. Well, and if Flora, as you know, is just a fantastic person and a
Yes,
very generous scholar. So,
yes,
and she takes a look at complex subjects, including the Washingtons at one point. Well,
indeed.
Karen, as we wrap up here, where can people find your book?
Gosh, so my book is called Lineage, Genealogy, and the Power of Connection in Early America, and you can find it at your favorite local independent bookseller. It's also on all the big box places. It's published by Oxford University Press in 2025. It's got a lot
I
about
don't think
George Washington in it, actually.
I don't think you can see it, but it's actually behind my shoulder here, but it's too
Oh,
far
that's
away
nice.
for yeah.
Thank you.
See, I was clever
It's
like that.
behind mine too, somewhere.
Well, Karen, thank you very much. It's been a delight to talk to you as always. Thanks for your excellent contribution to In Pursuit. And just
Such
to
a
give a
pleasure.
preview, yeah, just to give you a preview, coming next week, two additional essays will publish, one by Danielle Allen on John Adams and the other on Abigail Adams by Joseph Ellis. So make sure you're subscribed to our Substack, or you'll also be able to find that on inpursuit.org. And go read Karen's essay too.
Thank you.
Thanks, Karen.
Bye,
Bye
everyone.
bye.